All right. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us on this afternoon's webinar. This is James from the Hunt Institute, and we are very excited about this conversation today and very happy to be joined by our two guests. Before we introduce them, I'm going to turn things over to the Hunt Institute's president and CEO, Dr. Javed Siddiqui, who's going to give some welcoming remarks. Over to you, Javed.
Thanks, James. We're excited to be kicking off today's conversation with the latest. It's a series we've started with some of our friends and partners who work in education and philanthropy. A great lineup for today's discussion. Bill Tucker from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and Todd Penner from the Michael and Susan Dell Foundation. Thank you to both of you for being with us this afternoon. Bill and Todd are going to talk about an issue that is top of mind for many of us right now in the field of policy and policymakers. How do we support students at these key transition points where they can move into and through higher education? Even before the pandemic, these transitions were key touch points for supporting student success, such as high school senior who needs help filling out the application for financial aid, which we're doing some pretty good work here in North Carolina around the FAFSA frenzy. Shout out to our friends at My Future NC. Also, the college sophomore who's trying to navigate course requirements for their program of study. These transition points are also important because they are places where equity gaps could become worse if policymakers and practitioners aren't thoughtful about making sure support is provided to those who need it most. In this new reality brought on by the pandemic, supporting students during these transition points has become even more challenging and certainly more important. Many students are confined to their homes, some of which are in communities that don't have access to reliable broadband internet. So how do we meet the students where they are, continue to provide these crucial supports in creative new ways? I'm excited to hear and confident that Bill and Todd will have some innovative solutions and thoughts on these issues that are in front of us, and I welcome them to this conversation. With that said, I'll turn it back over to James to get this conversation going.
Great. Thanks so much, Javed. I do want to make sure to get to our panelists as quickly as possible. Just a couple of super brief housekeeping notes from me. The first is that we will have time for audience Q&A, and we ask that you submit your questions using the Q&A feature, which is at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And please do include your name and organization as well. And also, if you would like to follow along with today's conversation on Twitter, please use the hashtag INT. I apologize for the train going by in the background. If you want to follow along on Twitter, please use the hashtag INTwebinar. Now let's jump into the conversation. I'd love for each of our guests to talk a little bit about the work that they do at their respective foundations, and also to say a few words about how they have been affected by this pandemic response. Bill, we'll start with you. Love if you could give a brief overview of the work that you do at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation.
Sure, absolutely. Thanks so much for having me as part of this webinar. I work and help to lead a portfolio that's part of what we call our Pathways work, which is really, as Javed said, is really about helping to create seamless pathways for students from high school into and through post-secondary education and into careers that are going to have mobility and opportunity, and knowing that many students' progressions are not linear. So how do we make it much more easier for students to navigate and succeed on those pathways? So that's the work that I participate in and we help to do. Did you want me to also say something about just COVID and how it's affected us and some of the response?
Yeah, please, that would be great.
Sure. As many of you know, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation is a global foundation, and we've been deeply involved in health, whether it's around vaccines or defeating infectious disease, such as malaria or polio. And as such, we have offices all over the world. We have a China office. And so I feel like I had a front row seat in many ways because we were seeing the pandemic coming from my global health colleagues and also our China office, which locked down and went into shutdown mode really early on this year. And so in some ways we were hearing from them, here's what to look forward to, here's what it's like. We were obviously hoping it wouldn't come to us, but it did. And so our foundation has been responding on multiple levels. One is obviously really trying to leverage as much expertise and also providing $250 million in funds to support efforts to combat the disease. and that's everything from supporting efforts around vaccine development and delivery to response in our home state of Washington. And then I think with a particular eye towards ensuring that any treatments or vaccines or other things that are developed are equitably available throughout the world, really with an eye towards the world's poorest people. On the U.S. side, we have, I think we've kind of, like many folks, we've gone through a couple different phases. Our immediate focus was on immediate response, and some of the things that we did as a national organization really looked to how can we support public goods that will help multiple communities. So on our higher ed side, we've been doing work on digital learning for a while. So how can we support those networks to really quickly activate and support post-secondary institutions as they made that switch and are continuing to make this switch, and we know throughout the next school year, from in-person instruction to digital or online instruction. We've also been we've done work for a while around emergency aid systems, and so working to ensure that institutions have systems to actually just deliver aid more equitably and efficiently and effectively to students. So really trying to scale up that work. On the K-12 side, some of the response has been around efforts to close the digital divide, less so in individual communities and much more so on what are the playbooks or what are the ways in which we can respond and think about supporting those who are working across many communities to help those communities think about and plan for and be much more strategic in how they access devices and internet access. We've also done things to support communities of educators and build communities of educators. One thing that was really notable, we have a project called Teacher to Teacher that supports educators to work together and created specialized communities because we knew that special education was a particular area that was really challenged in this pandemic. And so it was really neat to see the ways in which teachers, special education teachers, and those who worked with students to provide special education were able to come together, exchange best practices really quickly, or exchange ideas and how they were coping, how they were pivoting, how they were adapting. So we've been doing a number of these things. I'll save it a little bit. We've also been doing a lot of work around advising navigation these transition points, which I'll talk about in a little bit.
Great. Thanks very much, Bill. Certainly sounds like the foundation is responding on a number of different fronts, and we will look forward to hearing more about that throughout the conversation. Todd, pretty much the same question over to you. Would love if you could give a high-level overview of your work at the Michael and Susan Dell Foundation.
Absolutely. Thank you again for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. So the Michael and Susan Dell Foundation is a family foundation like the Gates Foundation. We have 3 countries that we focus on: the U.S., India, and South Africa. And the focus and the mission of the foundation is to transform the lives of children living in urban poverty. And we do that here in the U.S. primarily through education work and health work. And I oversee 2 programs at the foundation. I oversee our college preparation and completion portfolio, which is all about assisting organizations and institutions that are trying to help low-income, often first-generation college goers get ready for college, get into college, and to complete college with a bachelor's degree. And then we also have an in-house college completion program, which has a scholarship component called our Dell Scholars Program, and I oversee that work as well. That program, supports 500 students each year and provides them with a scholarship, laptop, but most importantly, wraparound support to help them wherever they go to college, and our students are at over 500 schools across the country. Wherever they are, we support them in their efforts to obtain a bachelor's degree with as little debt as possible. So those are the things I oversee. As far as the foundation's response to COVID, what we've really done is put COVID first on all of our plates in terms of what we are doing. So by that I mean the foundation committed to spend over $100 million specifically in response to COVID. And that's being done across our 3 geographies. Most of that work is being done in the education space because that's where most of our work in all of our regions is, but we are also participating from a health side. For example, we are supporting with a $20 million investment the amazing work that Gates is doing on the therapeutics accelerator work to find therapies for COVID. And so that was probably our biggest investment. But the rest of the money is being earmarked for our existing grantees. So we've decided that while the needs are many and the needs are deep, we feel like focusing on our existing grantees across all of our portfolios is the most leveraged way that we can use the money we have available to us. And so we are working with our existing grantees to see what they need so that they can serve their students better, that they can serve more of their students, more students than they were serving before, because we realized that many students, once COVID hit, whatever supports they had were either reduced or even lost. And so we're looking at ways of how we can increase the scale that our grantees currently have. So like I said, all of our grant making for the foreseeable future will be focused on COVID response with our existing grantees. And across the different portfolios, we're looking at different ways to do that. In my portfolio, we're looking at how we can help programs that already offer virtual support to students, how they can do that better and wider. We're looking at programs that and organizations that have earned revenue that is in jeopardy. And by earned revenue, I mean contracts with school districts or states or whomever that is paying them for their services. In many cases, that revenue is now either in jeopardy or delayed. So we're looking at ways to help bridge the gap for those organizations. And then for our Dell scholars, we're looking at ways to ensure that those students have reliable internet access, and something that while all of our students have laptops, not all of them have reliable internet in the once they were forced to leave their campuses. And so trying to figure out ways to provide them with not just access and reliable access, but also data plans that they can afford. Many of them are living at home again, and their families don't necessarily have that opportunity for them. So helping those students with that. So that's some of the ways that we're focused from both the foundation standpoint and from my portfolio.
Great, thanks very much, Todd. Very helpful and a very nice transition into the first question that I'm hoping to ask you both. As a reminder, we have seen a couple questions come in, but please submit your questions through the Q&A feature at the bottom of the screen, and we will get to as many as possible. But I'd like to start by kind of following up on what both of you said in your opening remarks, and I'm going to start going back to you, Bill. You mentioned the work that you do to support students through structured pathways as they seek to enter higher education. I think we all know that a lot of those pathways have been disrupted in pretty significant ways by the COVID-19 pandemic. And folks who might have thought they were all set to enroll in an institution a couple months ago, maybe rethinking their plans. And we've also seen some surveys that indicate that students of color are more likely to be rethinking their plans than white students. So I wanted to ask how you and some of your partners in communities are thinking about how to support students who thought they were on track to enter higher education and thought they had a structured pathway and are now trying to navigate all of these new concerns that have been brought on by the pandemic.
Absolutely. And I think that disproportionate impact on a system that already is disproportionately inequitable is really concerning. I think on a few levels, I mentioned a few immediate response pieces where I think we're trying to respond to the very current needs, but do that in a way that really helps us think about recovery and about long-term system strengthening. So one example, just to make this really tangible, in Todd's home state of Texas, there's a group of folks working in Dallas around the Dallas Promise, which is a regional promise program. And they've noted for a long time that a number of barriers that students face as they try to transition from high school into post-secondary, even students who've already applied and maybe accepted, there are a number of enrollment barriers, many of which involve in-person processes, where they have to actually physically go in, or you got to meet this deadline or that deadline, or I got to move my transcripts over. Those were problems to begin with, and they are immense problems now in a time where physical distance or physically taking something may be dangerous, or getting your school, which is closed, to send a transcript is hard. So they're actually working on a way to streamline all of these processes and make them digital, so that students can make these processes more easily, that institutions can receive data. And that's an example of something that's immediately responsive to student needs now, really taking some of these barriers out of the way of students who might be most vulnerable at this time. But it also points to the opportunity to say, wow, this is a time when maybe people are willing to take away some things that were we'd always done it that way before and kind of had always been doing it. Maybe we're willing to make some changes, which could actually lead to some long-term changes that reset and provide better access. So we're really excited about those types of opportunities. I think we've also just been incredibly inspired. We've seen that the college access, nonprofits and organizations that work in this field, schools and school districts, many of them, the ones that had a lot of foundational elements in place have been better positioned to respond. So one of our grantees is Say Yes Buffalo. They work with the whole city of Buffalo and kind of a collective impact approach. They also run a scholarship program and support students. They were just right out of the gate in responding. They're like, we're going to call every single high school senior, and we're going to keep calling them, and we're going to make sure that they know that there's someone there to support them and help them with questions, help them navigate new financial realities, help them figure out, maybe some hadn't finished their post-secondary planning yet, or maybe some had plans. They thought that they were in a pathway to have a job here, and that doesn't exist anymore. So just those immediate responsiveness, the organizations and schools that were sort of set up, we're already thinking in a more active way. We reach out to every student, we track every student, we ensure every student has a post-secondary plan. They were really well situated to do those in a virtual way. And then the final thing that I think this has been really, really neat also, we've seen so much adaptation, which has been really interesting. And I think, again, paves the way to think about how do we use these digital tools or virtual tools in hybrid ways, or in ways that will last with us. Because we know in this area, like, relationships are so important, and it's not just a bot or a website, but we really need those relationships with students and their families and with educators. But are there ways that we can use the technology now that we're having to experiment with it, that'll lead to lasting change? So final example that has been really inspiring to me. We saw 3 partners in the field. One is the Common Application, which is the place, if you want to apply to college, you can go there and it's a website, you apply, and you can apply to many colleges at once. 1 million students use this each year. They figured out a partnership with a technology company called AdmitHub that has chatbots that many institutions use, texting features. And then they partnered with an organization called the College Advising Corps, which places near-peer recent graduates in high schools all across the country. I think they're in 17 states. And so they quickly, Common App was like, wait, we have the names and information on all of these students who are in the midst. They've applied to college through us. And so they were able to call through their database and identify over 170,000 students who were either first in their generation to go to college, or either came from a low income background. They had fee waivers and things like that. They partnered with AdmitHub, who said, great, let's make this happen. Let's give access to our chatbot. Let's reach out via text to all of these students and tell them that and begin answering their questions and providing them with information. But they didn't stop there. They said, College Advising Corps, let's have your near peer advisors who have a lot of expertise and who work directly with students. They're now giving small group webinars on certain topics, whether it's financial aid or navigating award letters or all sorts of critical topics, right? And at this time period, as students were deciding where they might go and figuring out their finances. And those near peer advisors are available for individual consultations. So students could raise their hand and say, no, I want to actually talk with someone individually, or a text message chain got elevated and there was a human touch. So this is a massive experiment. They dove in, which is really exciting. They just responded, adapted. But I think the exciting part is now we can learn from this about new models and ways to actually scale support in ways both scaled, but also personalized, and really, really do take advantage of these incredible advising resources. So those are some really inspiring examples, and we're excited about all of them that sort of have this immediate response, but also ways for us to learn and strengthen these systems in the future.
That's great. Thanks so much, Bill. Very helpful and hopeful examples. We had a similar conversation with folks from the John M. Belk Endowment and the J. Marion Sims Foundation, and they both also referenced College Advising Corps and how quickly they've pivoted to taking their near-peer advising model into the digital space. So it's great to hear that their creativity and their work is appreciated across the board. I'm going to turn to Todd now. Just a brief housekeeping mention. I saw one or two people raising their hand. I just want to remind folks that we're not going to be unmuting lines. So if you have a question, please do submit it through the Q&A feature. Todd, over to you. A pretty similar question, slightly different framing. As you think about your work to support currently enrolled higher education students through the Dell Scholars Program and others, similar to students who thought they were going to enter higher education, students who are already enrolled have found that their plans for going back to campus in the fall have also been disrupted. And again, we've seen evidence that these disruptions have disproportionately affected students of color who are currently enrolled in higher ed. So would love if, kind of similar to Bill, you could talk about how the work of you and your partners has been adapting to meet some of these disruptions brought on by the pandemic.
Absolutely. So I want to start by actually pointing out some good news, which is I think when we're a month or so into COVID and seeing what was going on, and there was a lot of fear that between the economic realities that these students are now facing and the challenges with taking courses online, that we would see a lot of melt, so to speak, over the summer by not just students who are planning to enroll in college, but also students who are already in college and just deciding either I can't afford it or it's not worth the money to do online courses, and so that they were going to step out and basically not come back. The good news is, by many accounts we're seeing, that fear is actually not going to manifest itself. We're seeing in many different ways more students planning to re-enroll this fall than we expected, which is obviously great news. I think several things are contributing to that. I think the idea that students couldn't afford to go to college. Many of the students we're talking about, they actually can't afford not to go to college. And the reason for that is by qualifying for things like Pell Grants, by getting supports from their universities or colleges, they're actually in a better financial place by going to college than they would be if they were at home, not necessarily having a job and not getting any financial support. So that's one thing. I think the second thing is that I think everybody on the call is probably seeing this as well, as more and more schools are announcing at least some form of hybrid college this coming fall, where students will be in both physical classes and online. And so it's not going to be the 100% online that most of these students faced for the semester that just ended. So I think that's the good news. As far as what we're seeing folks doing about it to ensure that more students stay and continue. One thing is providing emergency funds. So we know the CARES Act gave many universities money to go directly to students, and the schools are distributing that money to students in the form of emergency grants or emergency aid, which is certainly helping these students. I think some other things we're seeing, one is, as I mentioned earlier, that we're trying to do, but others are doing it at a much larger scale, is trying to address the tech divide. So making sure that their students, whether it's a college, making sure that laptops are available to their students who don't have one, or whether it's a community-based organization finding ways to get their students laptops, making sure that they have that technology that they can stream their courses, and making sure now that they'll be able to do that in the fall. Many courses will be available both in person and online, and so making sure that students have not just the laptops, as I mentioned earlier, but the internet access, the unlimited data plans that they can afford, to make sure that the technology divide doesn't cause a disproportionate impact on the most vulnerable students. The other thing I would say that we're seeing folks do is use data, primarily predictive data, to address student issues before they're actually becoming issues. Georgia State's a great example of this. They've invested a ton of money in data and analytics about their students, and they're now using it in a proactive way to basically reach out to their students before their students have had a chance to really fall by the wayside. They're looking at all areas of the student that they have data for, and using that to make targeted reach outs to the students to address what they see. So whether it's a student who, and this is primarily looking backwards, but students who were not attending their online courses. It was much easier for them to take quote unquote attendance when you could see who's logged in versus who's taking physical attendance in the classroom. And so they could see patterns of students not showing up to their classes and then reacting to that, making sure that the students were okay and what the reasons were, and was it a technology issue or was it an affordability issue, and then addressing that. But having, the key point here is that having data, real-time data about your students enables these organizations to be much more nimble and much more proactive in responding to the needs of their student and making sure that they don't leave the system. And obviously we all know that it's much harder to get a student who's stopped out back into school than it is to keep a student who's already in. And so using data, I think, is one of the key ways to do that.
Thanks very much, Todd. You know, it's funny, as Bill was talking about institutions that are better positioned to adapt because they built these systems, my mind went to Georgia State, and we heard from Dr. Tim Rennick, who spoke to our Complete Tennessee Leadership Institute class, and he said, you know, the GPS advising system has been pretty seamless. We've had, I don't remember what he said, but 800 some positive interactions since the pandemic. So I think that is a great example of how there are some systems put in place that we might think about scaling or replicating in other places. We now have a number of questions. Thanks very much for everyone who submitted. Again, I apologize if we're not able to get to all of them. We will try to follow up as necessary, but one of the first questions comes in from Jeff Gran with Credential Engine. And Jeff asks, how might data, to your most recent point, Todd, how might data help us improve the connections between learning and working? Who stands to benefit the most? Any risks? I'd love for you both to quickly respond if possible. Bill, maybe we'll start with you.
Sure. Todd mentioned a number of things. The one thing that comes to mind is that we have to connect college and careers, or post-secondary opportunities and careers, right? And as we think about different pathways for students, the employment climate has just changed incredibly rapidly. And I think it's safe to say that there's going to be a lot of uncertainty over the next coming years, and pathways or programs of study that might have led to, let's say, this great job in hospitality, those jobs may not exist for a while. And so the more that we have data to understand those trends that are happening, it's going to help our programmers, our institutions, our advisors, our students adapt more quickly. That's going to be really, really important. That, again, I think going back to this theme, right, that's always been important. We've needed to build those systems, but we're going to need some really quick adaptation, and understanding what we're adapting to is going to be vital, and we're going to need data. I'll just mention one other piece on data is we need data to understand who gets access to which opportunities and which pathways and which tracks. And again, we've have a history and a structural systems here that have led to tracking and inequitable access to opportunities across race and class. And if we're not particularly attentive to those issues right now, they will not only be replicated, but heightened and amplified. And so we really have to be thinking about that from the beginning, and we have to know what's going on, and we have to have data to proactively avoid that and disrupt those patterns.
Great, thanks, Bill. Todd, I wonder if you could say a few brief words on this idea of using data to connect working and learning.
Yeah, so I'll say in full honesty, we don't focus a lot on the transition from college to work. That's just not a priority for us. But what I do know about the situation is that part of the opportunity, I think, is also around conveying what students have done beyond just the credits they've earned in ways that employers can use that information to make decisions about the qualifications of candidates that they're interviewing. So not all jobs require a person to have a college degree or a bachelor's degree, which is what we tend to focus on. And there's a lot of work that students are doing in their lives that doesn't show up on a college transcript, whether it's work in the military or work in jobs that they're doing that is truly relevant for the next job. And so this idea of data, I think, is more than just college information going to employers. I think it's all the information that students have acquired and making sure that employers are getting that data as well.
Yep, thanks, Todd. We will add prior learning assessments to the list of things that were important before and have become even more important in the wake of this pandemic. Next question comes from our friend, Paula Santana. Hi, Paula, from the Lumina Foundation, who asks, how can the models being described in this conversation be adapted to respond to the needs of adult learners who may be considering whether to enroll in post-secondary education, including those that may have some college no degree and may be looking for opportunities to upskill or reskill? Bill, we'll go first to you for your reaction.
You know, I'm going to let Todd go first on this one because
Sure.
I think he has a little more depth on this subject.
Sounds great. Todd?
Yeah, so again, a disclaimer, we do not focus on adult learners. That's just a decision we've made. We focus on first time in college and students who are coming directly out of high school. But I think the things that we're seeing for those students in many cases apply to adult learners. And by that, I mean, what we're seeing right now is a mission of organizations and institutions to be more reactive to where students currently are and less about you need to conform to our model and more about how do we conform to them. And you're seeing this with all the things I mentioned earlier about making sure that their students have technology and making sure that their students have what they need to manage college in this digital way. Well, the same goes with adult learners, because most, I think, or many adult learners are in situations where their schedules are not as flexible, where they're working full-time or part-time, much in the same way that most of our Pell students are. And so this idea that we can't just have things available and expect that the students will be able to change their schedules to meet ours, I think is something we're seeing. So whether it's offering things at different hours, in evenings and weekends, rather than being open in a quote unquote 9 to 5 kind of model for face-to-face learning, I think we're seeing that, and that's certainly going to be helpful for adult learners. The idea of taking courses and seeing instruction online where it could be recorded and viewed later. Again, I think it's all about making sure that the institutions are meeting their students where they are, and being much more student-centric in their thinking, as opposed to the historical way of this is how college works, and therefore students need to accommodate us.
Yep, great. Thank you, Todd. I think meeting students where they are is definitely another theme of a lot of the conversations we've been having recently. I will now move to a question from Chris Braun, who is the Executive Director of Bottom Line. This is directed at both of you. And Chris asks, in light of the impact of COVID-19 on students in high school and higher ed, I'm curious if you and your teams have been thinking about potential new metrics or measures for assessing the effectiveness of virtual support and advising. Which of these do you think are most promising for strengthening higher education advising long-term? Bill, I know you referenced you wanted to chat more about advising, so maybe I'll kick this one to you first.
Yeah, Chris, Bottom Line is such a strong program. I'm actually hoping he'll inform all of us what they're learning. I think the way we've been thinking a lot, and some of the pieces we've seen are not so much around virtual or not virtual, but what is it? How does virtual add value to relationships and in person? And so I think in some ways we're trying to understand the contribution, particularly from a learning standpoint, so we can understand how we can use these closer together. So I don't have a perfect metric, or we haven't done that work, and that's what we're really hoping to learn from the field. But that's a little bit of how we're trying to think about this, particularly as we move from response to thinking long-term, not either or, but how do we put these models together?
Thanks, Bill. Todd, anything to add?
Yeah, the one metric I referenced earlier, which I think is one that I know for our grantees was really not very front and center, but is now, is this idea of attendance. However you want to define attendance, whether it's engagement, whether it's participation, but this idea that students not participating or not attending could be an indication of something more or something different than you expect. I mean, in the old world, not attending usually meant that a student either wasn't interested in the course or had dropped out. Well, now it could be that it's less about desire and more about availability, right? So does the student even have an opportunity to attend? Do they have the hardware and everything I've talked about? I'm not going to rehash, but I think this idea of participation or attendance is a metric that I think most programs haven't thought much about, but to me now is starting to become important, because it's a signal as to whether or not it's a student who is basically needs help, and especially the universities. I think the organizations like Bottom Line have more of a holistic relationship with their students and are more in tune to what's happening with them. But for the institutions, attendance could be a huge metric in making sure they know which of the students they need to work with.
Great. Thanks very much, Todd. I like that idea of how even existing metrics have taken on new significance or might tell us new information in this new reality. Another question from an anonymous attendee who goes back to the reference to melt and says that summer melt is something that's certainly on people's minds right now, but this attendee points out that we're already in the summer and it might be a little late to start summer melt interventions. And so they ask if either of you know about promising low-cost strategies that an organization might try to implement within the short time frame of a couple of weeks. Basically anything that you've heard of as a promising way to kind of hit the ground running and trying to address some of the disruptions that might be happening to students in the summer. Bill.
Sure, I can start. You know, a lot of organizations are using texting. The key issue is you need to have students' cell phones or mobile number to connect with them. There's platforms that do that type of work. And I think one way in which we see folks using that is not just to assume that texting is just going to take care of it, but in some ways to be able to get a better sense, kind of where Todd was going with the attendance piece. Can we use this as a way to figure out who we might need to most engage with, or how do we focus our resources? Because doing that also helps you. I would say the other thing on the sort of short time frame, we have seen the normal cycles really disrupted. So, you know, normally students decide where to attend on May 1st. Well, that was extended to June 1st in some places, and in some ways it's even rolling on now because of all the disruptions and students only now finding out about will campuses be physical or not, and finances. We envision that in some ways this transit, and then you say, oh, well, they're in their places and they're enrolled. There'll be a lot of students who are still in those disruptions or still switching places for a while. We envision that, you know, if we think about summer meld as just a summer issue, we should really think about it as going throughout the whole year, because there'll be students who for all sorts of reasons may not be able to enroll in August or September. And so the question is do you lose them? Are you able to re-engage them? Maybe they had to go to work because their mom was laid off. But how do you continue to stay connected? So I would encourage us to think a little differently also about the kind of neat time periods and think about how we can stay connected and keep students engaged, even if those time periods are a little different than they normally are.
Thanks, Bill. That all makes a lot of sense. Todd, anything to add?
Yeah, I think Bill's definitely on to it in terms of summer melt is not the message anymore. It's melt, period, whenever it's going to happen, because it is going to happen much more fluidly than it ever has before. The other thought I had on what you could do now, I mean, again, it's about data for me, and just sending out even a survey monkey to your students to see where they're at and asking them questions about what their situation is and being able to identify what the problems are that they're facing. Hopefully just to start a conversation. I don't think you'll solve it through a survey, but certainly if you can avoid having anonymous surveys, surveying your students, whether it's through a texting platform, whether it's through SurveyMonkey, whatever, get information about your students as quickly as you can so that you can address the issues before it is too late.
Great. Thanks very much to you both. Moving on to our next question, which is from Audrey Fish, who I believe is from More Than Bootstraps in New Jersey. I hope I'm getting that right, Audrey. She asks, going back to the issue of connectivity, is there any way that organizations can benefit from the work you are doing to help with Wi-Fi and devices like laptops? And also, Audrey is also wondering whether telecom companies have been a part of these discussions about solutions regarding the digital divide. Todd, it looks like you might want to jump in on this one.
Yeah, I can take that one or start with that one. So one thing that we've tried to do with our Dell scholars is leverage the relationships we already had with existing telecoms and existing hardware providers to try and get better deals for our students. So for example, with our Dell scholars, we just struck a deal with AT&T Mobile to provide Wi-Fi devices or MiFi devices and unlimited data plans for a year at a rate that is more commensurate with the corporate rate we get than what our students could get if they simply called up AT&T and said, I want a Wi-Fi and I want a MiFi and I want a digital plan. So that's one thing we've tried to do is take advantage of relationships that you already have at larger scale and see if you can add your students into those to get them the best deal possible.
Thanks, Todd. Makes a lot of sense. Bill, anything you want to add, or should we?
No, nothing else on that one.
Okay, great. Our next question comes from Sed Sewell from the Atlanta University Center Consortium, which is the largest and oldest consortium of HBCUs. And the question is about how you both are thinking